This episode was originally recorded in the end of 2023. You are listening to Pharmacy, IT, and Me, your informatics pharmacist podcast. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Pharmacy, IT, and Me podcast. I'm your host, Tony, and on today's episode, we have a special guest, Dr. Lauren Curtis, on the podcast today to share about her journey into healthcare technology. So, Lauren, how are you doing today? And thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, of course. I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing okay. We just tired all the time now.
That's expected.
Yeah. So, like you had a really interesting journey. I've seen like you on LinkedIn posting a lot of different things about healthcare technology. I know you used to work over at, Amazon a while ago, but before we get into all of that stuff, can you kind of tell listeners a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, pharmacist by degree. I went to Virginia Commonwealth University. I now am based outside of the Boston area, which is a pretty big hub for these types of companies. Lots of pharma companies here, and really transitioned from community into health tech almost 10 years ago now, and have sort of been bouncing around, finding different ways to use my skill set in order to build in the space and really love it. Got 2 kids and just trying to be present for them and have as much work-life balance as I can as I build my career.
Awesome. So I know you talked about, getting into health tech but initially by training you are a pharmacist, and I was wondering like what kind of drew you to the pharmacy field initially.
I think this is probably a really common story with pharmacists, or maybe I just gravitate towards the ones that felt similarly to me. But I always knew that I wanted to go into healthcare because I think a lot of us equate healthcare with helping people, and I really wanted to do that with my life and my career. That being said, I didn't really want to deal with blood, so I was looking for what could I do that could sort of avoid that part of it. And pharmacy was really what came out on top. I also had an experience as a patient. I'm a migraine sufferer. And so in college, I had a pretty profound experience with the campus pharmacist who like really talked me through questions that I had around some triptan therapy that I was being put on, and just was that support person when for the first time, I was without family. I was by myself trying to take care of this health problem I was having. And it really shaped how I felt about the entire possibility of pharmacy as a career. On top of that, I went to University of North Carolina for undergrad, which is where this happened. And they've got a great pharmacy program as well. So I feel like I had a really strong foundation before I made that decision. But yeah, that's sort of what led me to pharmacy.
It's funny because like the whole thing about blood. I've heard a lot of people say that, and it's funny because in my program, a lot of people do say that. Some of my friends do, and then the very first thing we do in the first 2 weeks is like give immunization shots and get licensed, which is blood everywhere. So
Yes. Well, it's funny because so I feel like back in the day when I was in school, that is not one of the first things we were doing. It was kind of newer. But as I began practicing, it was like one of my favorite parts of being a community pharmacist, and the part that I still miss. Like if I could pick it up somewhere, like go to an independent pharmacy and give immunizations every once in a while, I'd be very happy. So like that amount of blood does not scare me, but like surgery was out. That was not happening.
oh yeah, that would be too intense for me too. So, after you finished pharmacy school, I do see that you kind of went into the community side and then did that for a while. And you were a pharmacy manager as well. And in that kind of like moment of time, what was it that, kind of got you thinking about health tech as a possibility for like a career change, or not change, but, like a different career path to get into?
Yeah. I think that the things that I liked about community pharmacy, one-on-one patient care, being that sort of advocate for folks that they could talk to anytime, day or night, sort of their first line of questions from a healthcare professional, all of that was really appealing to me. And I loved building relationships with people. But it was over time that I felt like some of those things were fracturing at the community level, that I really started thinking that maybe I needed to change, because it didn't feel like the community pharmacy that I knew was coming back, right? It was veering further away from where I wanted it to go. And I felt like I was losing control over that experience. I didn't feel like I had time to counsel people. Some of my regulars that came in and would want to talk to me, I didn't have time for that. I was constantly on the phone with insurance companies. And, it was all usual things, but especially becoming a pharmacy manager and trying to manage metrics for your location, you really start digging into whether or not these metrics actually are benefiting the patients at all and how you can really relate improvement in one area to better patient outcomes. And it was sort of at that point that I started, like, it sort of entered the back of my mind. It wasn't until I was about to have my first kid, though, that I was just kind of like, I don't think that these hours that I'm working and the amount of stress that I'm having is really going to be great for a family long term. And I started looking for something else. That search really wasn't very long, and nor did I think that like health tech was going to be it, because it didn't even really exist at the time. There were very few, pharmacies that were serving patients remotely. Most of them were attached to PBMs as mail order facilities. And I had heard of that as a potential, and I thought maybe I knew some people working from home that did that. But really, there was a company local to me that I found out about that was just starting up, and I thought the idea of a startup in healthcare sounded really novel, which sounds so silly now because they're all over the place in 2023. But I was really interested, and I thought that I'd go ahead and take the leap.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Like, yeah, the whole like after COVID happened, there were so many new health tech startups that happened during
Yeah.
that time. So, but you started like back when it was still, not new, but fairly like small, I guess, right?
Yeah, yeah, there were definitely telehealth companies out there. I feel like this concept of retail pharmacy being delivered in this format or in an e-commerce format was still relatively new. I mean, even the big box stores were just starting to roll out some of these more digital aspects of their services. So, as an example, I was at CVS. I remember one of the last things that we were rolling out before I left my role there was like enrolling people for text messages, and getting them onboarded to that so that they could answer things via text. And that was sort of the big technology that was happening in retail pharmacy at the time. So this concept that people could order things online and have this sort of great experience that was well designed and beautiful and easy to understand was pretty new at the pharmacy level for sure.
Yeah, I also remember during that time, like around when I was in school, they were also rolling out they're kind of like vending machines at the outpatient pharmacies for
Mhm.
like retrieving meds if like the pharmacy's closed. And I thought that was pretty cool. I don't know whatever came out of it. I was at Long's Pharmacy when they were starting to roll that out, and then it got bought out by CVS. So I don't know what happened to it. But yeah, it was like all these like really cool, like experimental things that people were doing. But
Yeah, I don't know what happened to that either. But I definitely remember that.
oh, okay. So you did experience that as well then.
It was not while I was still at the store, no, but it was definitely I was hearing conversations about it, and, it was just, one more example of those types of technological advances that are happening in healthcare that people are like, "Do we like this? Do we not like this? What do we think?"
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, it is some extent of trial and error, right?
For sure, which, can be a scary concept in healthcare.
Yeah, yeah. And then, after your time at CVS, you went to PillPack. Can you kind of describe, your journey there? I see you have two different roles that you kind of like were going through at PillPack.
Yeah, I think that's probably what has made it onto my LinkedIn profile, but I think that many people that have been a part of a startup will tell you that, like, often you're just picking up whatever work needs to be done, and you worry about, like, what the title is and naming what that work is at some other later date. So I think I wore many hats during my time there, but when I initially made the transition, I went from, retail pharmacist in the community to a customer experience pharmacist there. So essentially what I was doing was the part of retail that I thought that I would love the most and did love the most, which is answering questions, talking to people about their medications. I was onboarding new patients, but ultimately I was sort of managing what that experience was like when they called in or emailed or chatted with us. So there was a team of pharmacists that staffed that as well as technicians, and I served as manager for that department.
Oh, okay. So then when you kind of like you were there when PillPack was acquired by Amazon, right? Or
That's
was
right.
that? Okay.
Mhm.
So when that kind of thing happens, right? Like, is there a lot of like reshuffling, or is there kind of like a smoother transition? I'm just curious about like how that works.
Of course, yeah. I think that it really depends on the acquisition. From what I hear, when Amazon acquires companies, a lot of them they allow to run as their own sort of subsidiary for long periods of time, even in perpetuity. And so I think what we saw at PillPack was there was a lot of us being able to run as independent for quite a long time. But you did have Amazon leadership coming, seeing how everything ran, understanding the business. From an operational perspective, a lot of things were just like business as usual because the pharmacy locations were established. They were all being run by, licensed pharmacists in the states that they were operating in. And then we had some central hubs where some of the more centralized processing was happening. But from like a corporate perspective with some of the non-clinical roles, that did feel like it was starting to roll up into Amazon, and there was some restructuring around how the ownership of different areas was going on. And so, actually, that's sort of what happened with my role. At the time of the acquisition, I was no longer in that clinical sort of customer experience pharmacist role. I had gone over to more of an operational side of things, continuous improvement, project management, as well as like just starting with some light product management. And that side of the business was really going to be structured more within the Amazon umbrella after the acquisition.
Oh, I see. So when you kind of like went into that role of like a little bit more product management and program managing,
Mhm.
like what kind of day-to-day things were you kind of responsible for?
Yeah. So, yeah, I made it sound like it all sort of blurred together, and that probably isn't helpful for some people to hear because I constantly am getting questions about like, what's the difference between all of these PMs, right? There's project management and program management and product management, and it all sounds the same. But in some ways, there can be a blurry line. And so, what I'll say is that my role started becoming a lot of working in operations, but sort of being that operational representative to go to the tech teams and say, hey, here's the operational problem that we're having. I've thought about some potential solutions. Can we talk about what's technically feasible so that we can have some rest here? Because there comes a point in time, and I'm sure anyone in any level of pharmacy can appreciate this, right? In any business, where you can either scale with more people to throw at the problem, or you can scale with more efficiency, more technology. And so that's exactly what we were experiencing. It came down to there were some things that I was seeing where I was like, we can hire some people to do this at the volume that we need. Or here are some ideas that we could utilize to improve the technology in order to make the people that we do have more efficient. So, as project manager, I was sort of going to technology, pitching the ideas, and then like hoping that they would do what I needed them to do. As product manager, once I made that transition, it really became my job to prioritize that work. So while on the ops side, I was sort of like throwing over the fence and hoping that it happened, on the product management side, I was really the one who was having to prioritize that work against other things that the business needed. So that's sort of where the difference lies. Either way, from a day to day perspective, I was, looking at our business metrics that I was in charge of, looking at how we could move the needle, looking at what the business needed and our customers, and coming up with solutions to problems that both were having. So sometimes it was things that we had planned for, long term features we wanted to release, and other times it was more like firefighting the problem of the day. But either way, it was a lot of problem solving. And ultimately, if technology needed to be improved or introduced in order to solve those problems, I was communicating with our engineering teams in order to explain to them what needed to get done so that they could go build.
So what kind of skill set do you think helps make a successful product manager in the sense of like what you were doing with that Amazon pharmacy product?
Yeah. I think if it's okay, I'm gonna like also put the lens of clinicians as well on this in general. I think that one of the things that clinicians could be thinking about when taking on a role like product management is that one of the very big transferable skills is problem solving. That's what pharmacists are doing all the time and other clinicians, right? Lots of one-on-one problems that you're solving with patients. And product management is very similar to that. It's just that you're extrapolating to like a population level. It's less one to one and more one to many. So, you're problem solving at a level of like, what is the thing that I can fix today that's going to solve this problem for the largest group of people? And it may not be the largest, it may be, the most sick or the ones that need cost savings the most. Whatever you're trying to move the needle on. But really, that transferable skill of problem solving and being able to come up with creative solutions is one of the biggest things that I've harnessed. And I think for a long time I thought that I just needed to be more technical. In the end, it's really not about that. It's about being able to communicate customer needs and business needs to those that are more technical so that they can build the things. And ultimately that's a skill set that I learned as a pharmacist as well, is communicating really complex ideas to lots of different groups of people at varying levels of difficulty, if you will.
Yeah, it's funny, like, you kinda think about just typically, like, what we were trained for as, in pharmacy school is, like, translating the medical technical terms down into a patient level, like, understanding, right?
Mhm.
And, like, in this health tech space, it's kinda like a similar way, but then you're kinda translating between healthcare, like, speak and tech speak instead.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah, so yeah, I think like that kind of skill set, we don't really it's something that we kind of forget about in terms of like, hey, this is a skill set we have, right? That it's transferable and we can apply to like these other types of roles outside of like traditional pharmacy.
Yeah, I think it's just one of those things that pharmacists, we tend to be quite scientific, quite precise. And so, and we had this clear path around how we could get to our degrees. I think that like telling people sometimes that communication is a really strong transferable skill, people just think that's so soft and they don't understand it. It's hard to quantify, but it is really one of our strongest skill sets as clinicians. But it just feels so, like, soft and squishy, like, people don't really they're like, "That's not important. Everybody can communicate." It's really not the case.
Yeah, and it is hard to articulate like the importance of it because I feel like even though, in my own job through, a lot of email communication, like over time, my writing would get better because of practice.
Mhm.
And I guess like that's the thing. Like if you don't practice enough of it, then you don't feel like there's that skill that you have, I guess. So what I've
Right.
noticed, yeah, I guess like what I've noticed is that the students coming out early on in their career don't seem to think that the communication skill is that skill that they have. But I think over time, at least for me and some of my colleagues, I noticed that we start to realize it because we're using so much more of it in our career.
Mm. Mhm.
So
You're
I don't know
right.
if like, yeah, I feel like for you, I'm just like preaching the choir because you're doing a lot of that in your product manager roles.
Yeah. I also think that I just didn't have a full appreciation for it before because in all of these instances in school where we were given opportunities to practice this type of thing, I sort of assumed that it was like mostly my clinical skills that were under review and a lot less about my communication of those things. So I feel like we are given a lot of opportunity in school to practice our communication, but overall we're just so focused on getting the information right that we sort of forget that, like, how you're packaging it up is so important. Somehow that gets lost along the way, but like you said, even with, like, writing emails that maybe don't contain clinical information, you're still focused on being precise and clear and concise, that it just gets better over time, and until you really think about it, I don't think it's a skill that you think you have, just like you
Yeah,
said.
yeah. And then, like after your time at Amazon, you went through a few other types of companies, but you still had the role of like a product manager or some kind of like head of product type of role. I guess like my question there is it a lot different between different companies for that product management role, or is it still similar in a way that you can easily move between like different companies with the role like that's titled like a product manager?
Mhm. Yeah, so I think that's one of the things that I was wanting to discover in moving companies a couple of times. I think that I was very lucky to sort of learn the craft of product management, if you will, while at Amazon because it's really its own beast and its own sort of practice. There are lots of books written about it. There's lots of podcasts about it. There are frameworks that people swear by and ways of problem solving that are sort of the accepted ways of going about it. There's also accepted ways of communicating your ideas to people and which softwares you use to do that and et cetera. So it's pretty stringent at Amazon. And I think learning product management within the bounds of Amazon was extremely helpful because it gave me some like really good sort of boundaries around which I set like, okay, this is what I believe to be product management. And this is how I operate as a manager. As you move from company to company, I mean, you first notice it right within the job descriptions sometimes is some of them, depending on the size of company or depending on what their expectations are out of their product manager, some of them are more strategy focused, while some of them are more execution focused. And these are things you can start picking up on right in the job description based on like where they tend to say you're going to be spending your time. Most product managers would love to stay more on the strategy piece and allow, a project manager or someone like that to handle some of the more tactical pieces of the job. So yeah, based on size, based on what the company needs, I'd say the roles can differ, but the sort of roots remain the same. It is about problem solving for customers and making significant business impact for whatever the business goals are at that given time. It's also having some influence on what those goals are and what they should be. And so I think one of the things I've noticed is it's mostly the same, even though there are these like sort of blurry lines around what's in and out of scope for the role. But the differences come in similar to what you find as your job as a pharmacist. The work you're doing is the same, but the tools that you're using may be different. So the tools that we use to sort of visualize our work, to document our work, those all may change, but the actual day-to-day of what I'm doing is all the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, it's kinda like in informatics too, like, moving from hospital to hospital, there's gonna be fully customized EHRs, but the basic
Mhm.
concepts of, like, what needs to be done correctly, it's still pretty similar, so it's good to hear that that's also kind of the case with, like, the product management role.
Yeah. And then sometimes there's just different cultures around how teams communicate with one another, right? Like sometimes it's
Mhm.
lots of meetings, sometimes it's lots of documents, and sometimes it's PowerPoint presentations. So it is really important if you lean toward liking one of those over the others, that maybe you make sure that that's like the right fit for you. As an example, like famously, Amazon loves to write documents as opposed to doing presentation. And so that's sort of the style that I was trained in, and so anytime I have to adjust from that, it's okay for me, but it is an adjustment. So it's kind of funny to see how company culture can impact your job like that.
Yeah. I'm the kind of person that's always, like, afraid of, like, major changes, so I try to limit my jumping of positions just 'cause, like, I just don't I'm scared of what I don't know, so the other thing I wanted to kinda talk a little bit about too is that, usually you probably heard from, my other episodes, I always ask whoever's the guest about, like, what their advice is or, getting into the field, but before getting into that, it's kind of like related. I know that you started heyhealthtech.com. Can you
Mhm.
kind of tell us, yeah, just tell us a little bit about what that is and why you started it?
Yeah, I think yeah, why did I start it? But that the answer to that question morphs frequently, but what I will say is I started talking about my career transition on LinkedIn because honestly, just because people seemed interested in it. Even when I was working at PillPack and Amazon, there were other pharmacists that I was working with that were still in clinical roles that would come to me and ask me, "Hey, how can I make this transition? I'm pretty interested in what you do. It looks really exciting." And so I started helping people, and then it became like a lot of people. So then I started talking about it on LinkedIn, and more people seemed interested. And I was like, I get it. I was not told that this was a path. And part of that is because it didn't really exist. But I also think that I just, I wanted to see more examples of this out there so that other clinicians knew that there were alternatives if, one on one patient care wasn't for you anymore, or you just wanted to try something new, or you just have like a really strong affinity toward technology. So I started talking about this more and more and started the website along with a newsletter so I could just sort of get the word out, have a place where people could come if they wanted to learn about these things and also provide some career transition support if needed, coaching conversations with people, some resume reviews. And it seems to really have resonated. it's clear that this type of information needs to exist. And I know others are out there telling their story too. Like, I want that. I want the word to get out that there are other types of roles that pharmacists are qualified for, that you have a doctorate degree and going to more school isn't your ticket to transitioning into something different. And also just sort of normalizing the idea that not only is changing your mind and your career direction okay, you can be successful, but also sort of limit the amount of fear that's happening around technology right now. I started the website probably last fall, but then of course in the spring there was this, of course, the big boom with AI and everyone kind of wondering what does it mean for all industries, but specifically in healthcare, I feel like there's strong fear about what technology, specifically AI, can do, and really wanted to have a place where people could learn about things and not feel fear around, well, does this mean my job is going to get replaced at some point? Does this mean I have to learn about AI and I don't know anything about it? I don't think we do a great job figuring out how to stay on top of things once we're out of school, outside of our, our CE credits and going to some conferences. So yeah, just wanted a space where people could come and learn and chat with others and chat with me about my experiences.
Yeah, I really like that you have that ultimate list of health tech companies as a resource list. I think like because there's just been so many, and I don't know how often you keep it up to date, but there's just so many companies out there now for health tech,
Mhm.
and it's overwhelming to kind of look and see like, wait, is this a health tech company or is this something else that has a similar name? Like when you're trying to look for positions out there. So it's
That's
it's
true.
nice that you have that
Well,
that
thanks.
available.
There really are a lot of companies that sound very similar or have the same name and do two different things. You're so right. I think one of the reasons too that I started it was because more than just pharmacists wanted the information, which was not something that I was really expecting when I first started out. And so I started dividing that list by specialty, which is funny to me because in the end, I actually don't think that we need to draw these lines like, well, pharmacists can work at these health tech companies and, PAs can only work at these health tech companies. But I get so many questions like, "Oh, well, I'm such and such. Is it for me? Like, can dentists do this too?" And my answer is always yes. So if it's helpful to see a list specifically broken down by specialty, then great. But ultimately, all of those are fair game. If you have clinical expertise, then the folks on the tech side who only know the tech side and don't know the healthcare side are going to value your opinion and are going to appreciate it.
So, you started the Hey Health Tech website with all of these different like opportunities for people to kind of see out there. And, you have this resume review option or one-on-one coaching. And, like just on for this podcast right now, I just want to ask like if you had like just 3 steps, and you can kind of think about this, but you had 3 steps you want to like suggest to people who wanted to get into health tech, like what would those be? And I understand, it can vary, but if you just had to like choose three.
Yeah, there's probably a lot of steps, but yeah, I think these are the big ones. The first is to start researching companies. I think people think that they want to get into tech and it's really overwhelming. They're just like, "Oh, there's so much out there. I don't know what I want to do." And so they're like, "Well, I'm fine with anything. I just want a remote job in tech." And so it's more clear to me that they're maybe running from something instead of running towards something. Like, I highly recommend that people find companies that they really resonate with and they curate their search based on that. Because the last thing I want is for you to be in another job that maybe isn't a great fit and you're in tech and you've got to do the whole thing all over again. Like that's not what we want. So I highly recommend that people start researching companies that sound interesting. That's very similar. Now, granted, my options were very limited when PillPack was like the healthcare startup that I had heard of, but I was really aligned to the mission. And I was sort of like, if I'm going to leave my job, it's for this. And this is all I want right now. And so I don't know that people have to be that laser focused, but there are companies out there, say you're really into helping people with diabetes. There are probably 10 health tech companies that are focused on diabetes. Start your search there and see what seems interesting to you and what types of roles that they hire. That would be number one. Number two would be to update your resume. Often the people that are doing the hiring at tech companies don't necessarily have a clinical background. And so getting like a really long CV with a lot of clinical information on it can be really confusing. If you shorten it and you make it more specific to the type of information they want to see, you're painting sort of the picture of how your clinical experience is going to help them. That is going to really stand out from the crowd. And then third is I would just start networking. I would talk to as many people as possible that either have a similar career path to what you're looking for, or even people that you would be working with sort of adjacently. As a pharmacist, I never worked with a UX designer at all before I entered tech. And I think it would have been really interesting and smart to talk to someone who had that type of role and other roles before I got into tech. So I kind of knew what to expect out of them. What's their job? How does it impact me? How can I help them, etc. Also, those people can be really good referral resources when you're looking to apply to your dream job.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that that kind of like advice is pretty like it's straightforward enough so people can get started, and it will, be tailored to like what they're doing. And thanks for sharing that. And it's kind of like just clear enough for people to get started with. Like you were talking about networking. So my next question is like for people who wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way that they can send you a message or kind of get more information about maybe about Hey Health Tech or just maybe about your own career?
Of course. Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Lauren Curtis PharmD. Or yes, Hey Health Tech on Instagram and TikTok, or my website has a contact form. I'm always answering my emails as well. I love to hear about people who are even just thinking about this, all the way up to people who are like, I have been searching and I'm having a really hard time. I know that I'm stuck specifically here. How can you help? We're all in this together, and I just want us all to win. So feel free to reach out anytime.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll be putting the information to your LinkedIn and to more information about Hey Health Tech into our show notes for people who are interested in checking those out. But, again, thank you so much for taking some time to be on the podcast today, sharing your journey and sharing a little bit more about health tech and product management roles.
Thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Hope you enjoyed this episode of the Pharmacy IT and Me podcast. If you did, please rate us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or anywhere you're listening to this podcast. It really helps us reach more people who might be interested in learning more about pharmacy, informatics, and technology. If you would like to suggest a topic or somebody to be on the podcast, feel free to reach out to me on social media. I can be best reached on LinkedIn. Until next time, remember, technology is a tool, patient care is the goal.